Now, I could tell you today's story is about a stolen watch, but this one starts smaller than that. It starts with a bare wrist, a pale strip of skin where something valuable used to sit, and an old man's hands shaking too badly to hide what he was afraid of. A master watchmaker, once spoken of in the same breath as the greats of Geneva, whose hands built the finest thing they ever made, and then, years later, betrayed him by simply refusing to work at all. A Fifth Avenue jeweler, his oldest friend, 41 years running, found dead on his own shop floor behind a door locked from the inside, with nothing missing but the one watch that was never supposed to matter to anyone outside that room. A retired craftsman in Astoria, who took a fall down his own staircase, that his skull, on second inspection, disagreed with. A woman who crossed an ocean, chasing 11 years of silence about a father who walked into occupied territory in 1944 and never walked back out. A well-dressed Englishman who wasn't English at all, circling a Fifth Avenue storefront in a hat he never once took off indoors, asking polite questions about old-world craftsmanship that weren't polite at all. A nervous shop manager who once studied under the watchmaker himself and let slip over shop talk he thought was harmless, exactly the kind of secret a man shouldn't let slip. And then there's the thing nobody in this story counted on. A second case back, hidden beneath the first, built by two frightened young men in 1944 for a purpose finer and far more dangerous than telling time. So get comfortable, this one's called Nero Wolfe and the Master Watchmaker's Silence. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Trembling Hands. There are two kinds of visitors who ring the bell at the brownstone on West 35th Street. The ones who come because they want something from Nero Wolfe, and the ones who come because they're afraid of something Wolfe hasn't found yet. I've been opening that door for a good many years, long enough to tell the difference before the second knock. And when I looked through the one-way glass at 9:40 that Wednesday morning, I knew which kind I was about to let in. He was a small man, 70 or thereabouts, dressed in a grey suit that had been cut by somebody who knew what they were doing 20 years ago, and had been pressed that morning by somebody who still did. He had a face like a closed pocket watch, all the workings hidden, nothing on the surface but the hour. His hands were folded in front of him, and even through the glass I could see they weren't steady. Behind him, at the curb, a taxi idled with its meter running, which told me something too. A man in a hurry, or a man who didn't trust himself to remember how to get home. I opened the door. Yes? My name is Anselm Kessler, he said, in an accent that had started out Swiss and spent 40 years being sanded down by Manhattan. I would like to see Mr. Wolfe. It concerns a friend of mine. He died 3 days ago. That's the kind of opening line that gets you exactly nowhere with Wolfe before 11. But I've learned not to make that anybody's problem but my own. I told him Mr. Wolfe was engaged until 11 and asked if he'd like to wait in the front room. He said he would, and paid off the taxi first, counting out the fare with fingers that fumbled twice on the coins before he got them sorted. Then he came in and sat very straight on the edge of the yellow chair with his hat on his knee, not fidgeting exactly, but his right hand kept finding his left wrist and closing around it like he was checking a pulse. There was no watch on that wrist. There was a pale band of skin where one had been for a long time, and hadn't been for a while now. Diana found him first. She came down the hall at her usual quiet trot, the fastest and smallest of the five, and stopped 4 feet from the yellow chair with her ears up and her head tilted a fraction, the way she does when something about a person doesn't sit right with her. Not danger, exactly, just wrongness, the kind that comes off a man like a smell he doesn't know he's carrying. Kessler looked at her without alarm. "A Doberman," he said. "Beautiful animal. I had a dog like this once, in Zurich, before the war." He didn't reach for her. "Smart man. She knows I am frightened." "She generally does," I said. "Coffee, Mr. Kessler? It's a longer wait than most people care for." "No, thank you. I find if I hold something in my hands right now, I will only spill it." He said it plainly, without embarrassment, the way a man says a true thing. He's long since stopped being ashamed of. Caesar came next, unhurried, the way the alpha of any outfit comes when he's already decided a thing isn't urgent, and gave Kessler the long, level look he gives everybody before he decides whether they're worth Mars's attention too. Mars didn't bother. He took up his post by the hall table and watched the street through the gap in the curtain instead. Apollo did a pass through the hall and back out, checking the window latches on principle, the way he does every hour, whether anyone's asked him to or not. Loyal came last and settled by my chair with his chin on his paws, watching the old man the way he watches everybody, patient, unbothered, keeping his own counsel. Kessler watched them work the room the way a man watches a piece of fine mechanism. Not with fear now, but with something closer to professional appreciation. Trained, he said. Well trained. Not for show. I can always tell the difference. A watch built for show and a watch built to keep time are two very different animals, Mr. Goodwin, I said. Archie Goodwin. Mr. Goodwin. He nodded, as if filing the name the way he'd file a part number. You keep good time here too, I think. At 11 o'clock sharp I heard the elevator, and a few minutes after that, Wolfe's voice came through the intercom telling me to send the visitor in if he was still there. I brought Kessler back to the office. Wolfe was behind his desk, 17th of an acre of it, a bottle of beer at his elbow, and the look on his face of a man who has just spent 2 hours with orchids and resents every minute since, which is to say his usual look at 11:04. Mr. Kessler, I said. Mr. Wolfe? Kessler sat in the red leather chair, set his hat on his knee again, and looked at Wolfe, the way a man looks at a door he isn't sure he wants opened. You are the watchmaker, Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. I'd told him the name on the house phone, and apparently that had been enough. I was, Kessler said. My hands are no longer good enough for the work. I have not held a movement in 3 years. He held them up briefly, and they trembled, not badly, but enough. It is a joke God plays on men like me. He lets us build the finest things human hands can build, and then he takes the hands. You said on the telephone your friend died, Wolfe said. The police presumably are handling that. The police believe Emmerich Voigt surprised a burglar in his own shop and was struck for his trouble. Kessler's voice didn't rise, but something under it tightened. I do not believe that. Emmerich was my friend for 41 years. We came from Switzerland together in 1919, boys with nothing but our hands and what we'd learned from our fathers. He built the settings. I built the movements. Together once, a long time ago, we built one watch that neither of us should have built, and I think it is why he is dead. Wolfe's eyes had gone from half-shut to merely lazy, which is as close to attention as he shows a stranger before he's decided the case is worth the trouble of being fully awake for. Go on. It is called the Meridian, Kessler said. A chronograph, perpetual calendar, split-second complication, a case back that opens twice, once for the movement and once for a compartment no jeweler and no thief has ever found, because no jeweler and no thief knows to look for it. Emmerich and I built it in 19... We believed it was lost that same year. 3 nights ago I learned it was not lost at all, and the morning after I learned that, Emmerich was found dead on the floor of his own shop with the watch gone from his wrist. You wish me to find his murderer. I wish you, Kessler said, and here his hands closed around each other in his lap, to find the Meridian before the police do, before anyone does. What that watch contains was meant to save lives in 1944. Today it will only cost them. I am asking you to find it first, Mr. Wolfe, and I am asking you to understand that I may not be able to tell you everything about why. Not today. Perhaps not for some days yet. Wolfe regarded him for a long moment, the way he looks at an orchid that has bloomed in a color he wasn't expecting. Archie, he said, the notebook. I already had it out. Chapter 2. A case beneath consideration. Consideration. Wolfe leaned back until the chair complained, laced his fingers over the largest part of himself, and said, Mr. Kessler, what you describe is a matter for federal authorities, not a private detective. A wartime object, wartime secrets, a compartment concealing. What? Documents. You have not said, and I notice you have not said with some care. I have not said because I do not fully know, Kessler said. I know what we were told to build the space for. I do not know if what went into it was ever removed, or by whom before the watch disappeared. Then you're asking me to search for a needle whose shape you cannot describe, in a haystack you cannot locate, motivated by a crime the police have already filed as opportunistic burglary. Wolfe shook his head, a small definitive movement. I decline. I've watched a lot of people take that particular sentence on the chin, and Kessler took it better than most. He didn't argue, didn't puff up, just sat with it a moment the way a craftsman sits with a flaw in the metal, before deciding whether it can be worked around. "May I tell you what the watch is worth, Mr. Wolfe, before you decide finally?" "Worth is not the issue. 26 jewels, a case in 18-karat gold with a screw-down back of my own design, a movement I spent 4 years perfecting before the war interrupted me, and a provenance that includes, I am ashamed to admit, a certain amount of history that men in Washington would very much prefer, stayed buried in a drawer." Kessler's voice had gone quiet, almost gentle. "There are collectors, Mr. Wolfe, who would pay $80,000 for the Meridian on the open market if it were ever permitted to reach one. I do not offer you $80,000. I am not a wealthy man. My hands stopped earning what they once earned 3 years ago, but I will offer you every dollar I have kept from a life of careful work, which is $11,400, and I will offer you something else, which is the truth about what happened to me and Emmerich in the autumn of 1944. Once I am satisfied, you can be trusted to know it." "You said a moment ago you were not a wealthy man," Wolfe observed. $11,400 is a precise figure for a man claiming poverty. "It is precise because I counted it this morning, Mr. Wolfe, before I came here, sitting at my kitchen table with the passbook in front of me, wondering whether I was about to spend the last of what I have left on a fool's errand." Something moved behind Kessler's composed face, not quite a crack, but a settling, like a house shifting on old foundations. "I have no children. I have no family left in this country. I have Emmerich, who is dead, and I have whatever is left of my name in the trade, which will mean nothing at all if the wrong people finish what they started before I understand what it is they are finishing. Forgive me if the arithmetic seems cold. It is the only kind of arithmetic I still trust." That's the sort of number that moves the needle in this office. Though Wolfe would rather eat his own hat than admit it moves easily. He sat with it, eyes at half-mast, and I could see him doing the arithmetic that had nothing to do with dollars. The arithmetic of an old craftsman sitting across the desk from him. A man who'd built something extraordinary and was now watching it become the instrument of his oldest friend's death. "Archie," Wolfe said at last, "what time is it?" 11:20. "Then I have 35 minutes remaining with the Miltenia before lunch, and I intend to use them." He looked back at Kessler. "I will take the case, Mr. Kessler, on the following terms. Half your fee now, the balance upon conclusion, whether or not the conclusion pleases you, and you will tell Mr. Goodwin, this afternoon in full, what the Meridian's compartment was built to hold, and for whom, and how you came to learn 3 nights ago that it still exists. I do not investigate half a puzzle." Kessler looked, for just a moment, like a man being asked to open a door he'd spent a decade keeping shut. "There are men," he said slowly, "who may still be alive, who trusted my silence." "And there is a friend of yours, 41 years known, who is dead," Wolfe said, "and whose silence did not save him." Kessler nodded, slowly, the fight going out of him, the way it goes out of a man who has been arguing with himself far longer than he's been arguing with anyone else. "This afternoon, I need an hour, perhaps 2, to compose myself. Some of it I have not said aloud since 1944. "Archie will call on you at 4, Wolfe said, and stood, which meant the interview was over, and the orchids were waiting. "Good day, Mr. Kessler." He wrote the check himself before he left the office. $5,700, in a hand steadier on paper than it had been all morning, which told me something too. Whatever else was wrong with Anselm Kessler, his nerve came back the moment he had something useful to do with it. Chapter 3. The Shop on 5th Avenue. I called on Kessler at his apartment near Gramercy Park at 4, and what he told me over 2 hours and 3 cups of coffee he drank himself, since his hands managed a cup better than they'd managed hat and cane that morning. Filled 11 pages of my notebook, and doesn't bear repeating whole here. It comes out later, in its proper place, when Wolfe lays the whole thing out for a room full of people who needed to hear it more than I did. What matters for now is that I left Gramercy Park a little after 6 with a name, Rasmus Halvorsen, and a date, October 1944, and the distinct sense that Anselm Kessler had been carrying something heavier than a watch for 11 years. The next morning I went to the shop. Voigt and Kessler, fine watches and jewels, occupied a narrow storefront on 5th Avenue in the 50s, the kind of address that costs more per square foot than most people's houses and buys you the privilege of a doorbell instead of a door handle. A patrolman I half knew was still stationed outside when I got there at 9, which meant Kramer's people hadn't finished being thorough, which suited me fine, because thorough people leave things lying around for a man with eyes to notice. The shop manager, a narrow, nervous fellow named Corliss, who'd worked the counter for Voight going on 9 years, let me in on the strength of Kessler's name and a $5 bill that I put in his hand, mostly so he'd feel he'd earned the trouble. He was found right there, Corliss said, pointing to a spot on the Turkish carpet behind the main display case. Thursday morning, when I came in to open. The door was locked from the inside, Mr. Goodwin. That's the thing the police can't get past. Locked from the inside. And Mr. Goodwin, Voight on the floor with his head. He stopped and swallowed. With his head hurt bad. And the case there. He pointed to a velvet-lined display cushion under glass, empty but for the faint indentation where something had rested for a long time. That's where he kept it. The Meridian. Wore it himself, most days. But he'd taken it off Wednesday afternoon. First time in I don't know how long. Said something about having the strap looked at. Had the strap looked at, or was thinking about it? Had it looked at? There's a strap man. Works out of a shop 2 doors down. Does the fine leather work for half of Fifth Avenue. I saw Mr. Voight go in there myself. Wednesday around 4. I made a note of the strap man's name, Del Vecchio, and asked Corliss the question that actually mattered. Who'd been in the shop lately asking about the Meridian? Not buying, not looking, asking. Corliss's nervousness took on a different flavor, the kind that comes from a man who's been waiting for somebody to ask him the right question so he can stop carrying an answer around alone. There's been a gentleman, he said. Came in maybe 6-7 times this past month. Never bought anything. Always ended up talking to Mr. Voight in the back. Low voice, door shut. Mr. Voight got jumpy after those visits. Started double-checking the locks himself instead of leaving it to me. Told me last week if a certain kind of customer came in wanting to see the old pieces, I was to say Mr. Voight wasn't in, whether he was or not. Description. Tall, well-dressed, maybe 50, foreign accent, though not like Mr. Kessler's. Clipped, precise, English, maybe, or trying to sound it. Wore a Homburg, even indoors, which I always thought was strange manners for Fifth Avenue. I wrote it down and asked him one more thing before I let him go back to whatever a man does with himself, the week his employer's been murdered on the carpet 6 feet from the cash register. You ever study watchmaking yourself, Mr. Corliss? Formal training, I mean, not just counterwork. Something flickered behind his eyes, there and gone so fast I'd have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it on purpose. A little, years back. Why do you ask? Just building a picture, I said, easy as I could manage, and let it lie there for later. I walked the 2 doors down to Del Vecchio's next, where a small round man with a mouthful of pins in place of most of his conversation confirmed that yes, Mr. Vecchio had brought in a gold chronograph Wednesday afternoon, wanting the strap replaced, and no, he hadn't taken it back that same day, because the new strap wasn't ready. Del Vecchio still had it in the shop, in fact, minus the watch it was meant for. He say, when he'd be back for it? Said he'd send someone. Del Vecchio said around the pins. Never did. I collected the strap, dark alligator, hand-stitched, the kind of thing that costs more than my rent, on the theory that evidence is evidence whether or not the police thought to ask for it, and headed back downtown with 2 facts worth bringing to Wolfe before dinner. Voight had parted with the Meridian himself, voluntarily, the afternoon before he died, which meant whoever killed him hadn't necessarily taken it off his body at all, and somebody in a Homburg had been circling that shop for a month, asking about the old pieces in a voice that wasn't quite as English as it wanted to sound. Chapter 4. The Gallery of Interested Parties. I got back to the brownstone at 3:30, in time to type up my notes before Wolfe came down from the plant rooms, and in time to field the visitor who arrived at 4 sharp without an appointment, and without, apparently, any intention of leaving until she'd said her piece. Her name, she told Fritz at the door, was Margit Halvorsen, and she wanted to see whoever was investigating the death of Emmerich Voight. Fritz, who has strong opinions about unannounced visitors and stronger ones about his kitchen schedule, put her in the front room and came to find me looking faintly put upon. She was somewhere in her 30s, dressed plainly but well, with the kind of composure that takes real effort to maintain, and when I brought her back to the office, she sat in the red chair like she'd been rehearsing the posture in a mirror, the whole taxi ride over. My father, she said, before Wolfe had even settled into his chair, carried a message out of Denmark he never came home. I have spent 11 years trying to find out what that message was, and 3 days ago I read in the newspaper that a jeweler named Voigt was found dead with a valuable watch missing, and something about the word chronograph made my hands go cold. Mr. Wolfe, because my father's last letter to my mother mentioned a watch. I don't know why a schoolteacher's husband would write home about a watch of all things, unless it mattered more than a watch usually does. I need to know why. That put a name to one of the shapes Kessler had left undescribed that morning, and I could see Wolfe filing it exactly that way, not as sentiment, but as data. What was your father's name? Rasmus Halvorsen. He was a schoolteacher before the war, and afterward he was a courier, though I did not know that until years after he was gone. The Danish resistance kept careful records, eventually, of who did what, and who didn't come back. His name is on a list. So is the fact that his final assignment, in October of 1944, was never confirmed complete. My mother spent the rest of her life believing he simply vanished. I have never believed that. Men who simply vanish don't write home about watches first. How did you learn of Voigt's death, precisely? You said the newspaper. The Times, 3 days ago. A small item. I have been in New York 6 weeks, Mr. Wolfe, staying with a cousin in Brooklyn, working through what records I can find at the Danish consulate and the public library. I did not come to America to find a watch. I came to find out what happened to my father. But when a name and a date and a word like chronograph all arrive in the same 3 inches of newsprint, a person notices. Wolfe made a small sound that might have been sympathy and might have been simple acknowledgement of a useful fact, and asked her 3 more questions: where she was staying, whether anyone else knew she'd come, whether she had documentation of her father's work, before telling me to see her out and get her a taxi. She left him a Brooklyn telephone number and a photograph of a thin, serious-looking man in a schoolteacher's cardigan, which Wolfe studied for a moment longer than the arithmetic of the case, strictly required, before handing it back to her. She wasn't out the door 20 minutes before the next one rang the bell, and this one I'd been half expecting since Corliss's description that afternoon, though the Homburg he was wearing indoors confirmed it before he opened his mouth. He gave his name as Julian Price Hartford, and everything about him, the accent, the suit, the slim leather portfolio he carried like a man carrying something more valuable than papers, was constructed with the particular care of somebody who wanted you to notice the construction and be impressed by it, rather than wonder what it was covering. I collect fine horology, Mr. Wolfe, he said, once he was settled and had declined beer with the air of a man who found the offer slightly beneath him. I understand you've been retained regarding the unfortunate business at Voigt's shop. I'd like to make an offer, frankly, for whatever information your investigation turns up regarding the whereabouts of a particular piece, the Kessler-Voigt chronograph, known in certain circles as the Meridian. I am prepared to pay handsomely, and I assure you my interest is purely that of a collector. You've been asking Mr. Voigt about it for a month, I said, before Wolfe could answer, under a Homburg, in a low voice, with the door shut. Price Hartford's composure didn't crack exactly, but it developed a hairline fracture. I make no secret of pursuing pieces that interest me. You make rather a good secret of it, by all accounts, Wolfe said. Tell me, Mr. Price Hartford, in what circle is a watch of purely domestic manufacture, however finely made, spoken of in terms grave enough to warrant a month of clandestine visits and a closed door? Collectors are a discreet lot, Mr. Wolfe. Surely you appreciate discretion in your line of work. I appreciate it considerably less when it's aimed at me, Wolfe said. Mr. Goodwin will take your card. We do not sell information, Mr. Price Hartford, and I would advise you against assuming that a dead man's business partner is any less capable of noticing when he's being circled than the dead man was. That put colour in the Englishman's face that his tailoring hadn't accounted for, and he left with rather less ceremony than he'd arrived with, but not before I got a good enough look at his hands to notice a jeweler's callus on the right forefinger that a pure collector, in my experience, doesn't generally carry. The kind of mark left by years spent turning a loop screw, not decades spent merely admiring other men's work through one. Chapter 5. The Second Body. Kramer came at 8, which meant he'd had time to get thoroughly annoyed at homicide before deciding to bring the annoyance to us directly, a habit of his that Wolfe finds tedious, and I find occasionally useful. Kessler hired you, Kramer said, dropping into the red chair without waiting to be asked, which is the sort of thing that only Kramer and a handful of other people ever get away with in this office. I want to know why a 71-year-old watchmaker walks into a private detective's office 3 days after his partner's murder instead of walking into mine. He walked into mine, Wolfe said, because he believes I am more likely than you to find an object before it changes hands again, and less likely than you to make its recovery a matter of public record. Both beliefs strike me as reasonable. And what object would that be? Wolfe told him, the Meridian, the compartment, the wartime origin, all of it delivered in the flat, unhurried cadence Wolfe uses when he's decided a policeman has earned exactly as much truth as is useful, and not one fact more. Kramer listened with the particular stillness of a man taking mental notes he'll deny taking later, chewing the unlit end of a cigar he never once got around to lighting. And when Wolfe finished, Kramer sat back and studied the ceiling for a moment, like it owed him an explanation too. "There's a second body," he said. The room got quieter than it already was. Diana, who'd been lying by the bookcase, lifted her head. "A man named Otto Reinhold," Kramer said. "Retired jeweler, lived alone out in Astoria, 78 years old. Found dead in his apartment 2 days ago, before Voigt actually, but nobody connected the two until this afternoon, because Reinhold's death was written up as a fall. Old man, bad hip, tumbled down a flight of stairs. Except the medical examiner took a second look this afternoon on account of a phone call from a detective who'd read the Voigt file and noticed Reinhold's name in an old address book on Voigt's desk. Skull fractures inconsistent with a fall down a straight staircase. Somebody hit that old man before he ever started falling." Reinhold's connection to Voigt? "Same trade, 40 years back. Both of them worked for a firm that did settings and casework for half the jewelers on this street before the war. I've got a man pulling personnel records now." Kramer's jaw worked. Neighbors say a well-dressed man had come around asking after Reinhold twice in the week before he died. Nobody got much of a look at him. One old woman across the hall said he wore a hat indoors when he came calling, which struck her as poor manners, and I about fell out of my chair when I read that line in the report, because it's the same thing your man Goodwin's been asking Fifth Avenue about for 2 days, near as my people can tell. "My assessment precisely," Wolfe said, "though I would appreciate you arriving at it independently in future, rather than requiring my confirmation." "I don't like it, Wolfe," Kramer said, ignoring the jab the way he's learned to over the years. "Two old craftsmen, both connected to the war years, both dead inside a week, and you sitting here telling me it's about a watch with a secret compartment that's been missing since 1940. That's not a burglary gone wrong. That's somebody finishing a job they started a long time ago." "My assessment precisely," Wolfe said again, and this time Kramer didn't have a response ready for the repetition. Kramer stood to go a few minutes later, but paused at the door, looking back at the room with the particular expression he reserves for the dogs, which is a mixture of irritation and grudging respect he'd sooner die than admit to. Mars had come to stand near the doorway, the way he does when a visitor's leaving, not threatening exactly, just present, and Kramer eyed him the way a man eyes a subway train. He's decided not to race. "Keep me informed, Wolfe," he said. 2 bodies is a homicide investigation, whether you like the paperwork or not." "I generally do not," Wolfe said, "but I will keep you informed to the extent it serves the case." He'd nearly reached the hall before he turned back. One more time, the way Kramer does when he's decided he's given away more than he meant to and wants to even the score a little before he goes. "One more thing, Wolfe. My man out in Astoria talked to the beat cop who walks that block. Fellow says there's been a car parked on Reinhold Street 2 nights running this past week. Not the same car twice, but the same general shape, if you follow me. Somebody keeping an eye without wanting to be remembered doing it. Nobody's approached the building since the murder. Whoever it is seems content to watch for now." He settled his hat lower. "You want to tell me why somebody'd still be watching a dead man's building, or should I go on guessing?" "Because," Wolfe said, "whoever killed Otto Reinhold is not yet convinced they found everything he had to tell them, and is waiting to see who else comes calling on his memory. I would suggest, Sergeant, that your beat cop take rather more careful notice of anyone who does." Kramer grunted something that might have been agreement, and might have been irritation at being told his own business, and left for good this time, and after the door shut, I looked at Wolfe and said, "Reinhold worked settings and casework. Same trade as Voigt. You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I am thinking," Wolfe said, "that a compartment as fine as the one Kessler describes was not built by one man alone, however gifted, and that Emeric Voigt was not the only craftsman who knew where to look for it. I am also thinking, Archie, that Mr. Corliss's little flicker this morning, when you asked whether he had studied the trade formally, deserves rather more of our attention than a $5 bill's worth." Chapter 6. What the Caseback Knows. Kessler came back to the brownstone the next afternoon as arranged, and this time he brought with him something wrapped in chamois cloth that he set on the desk with the particular reverence of a man handling a relic. "This is not the Meridian," he said, unwrapping it to reveal a plain steel pocket watch, worn smooth with age. "This is the watch I carried through the war myself. I bring it so you can understand what I am about to explain, rather than merely hear it." He opened the case back with a fingernail, revealing the movement, and beneath it worked with a jeweler's screwdriver, so small it looked like a toy, which he produced from his waistcoat pocket, like a magician producing a coin. A second, thinner panel that lifted free to reveal a shallow cavity, no wider than a folded stamp. "Every fine chronograph has a caseback secured by screws or a hinge," Kessler said. "What Emeric and I devised in 1943, at the request of men I will not name because I do not know their names even now, was a second back beneath the first, invisible, unless you know precisely where along the rim to apply pressure, and in precisely what sequence. It is not something a locksmith finds. It is not something a jeweler finds, even a very good one, unless he was taught the trick by someone who already knew it." Wolfe leaned forward, which for Wolfe is the equivalent of another man leaping to his feet. "Show Mr. Goodwin." Kessler did, guiding my thumb along the rim, a press here, a quarter turn there, a second press at an angle that felt like nothing at all until the panel gave with a small, satisfying click that seemed too soft a sound for the weight of what it opened onto. I sat there a moment with the empty little cavity under my thumb and thought about how much history could fold itself into a space that size. "Who did you teach it to?" Wolfe asked. "Only Emeric worked the casework with me on the wartime pieces. But the technique itself, the double-back construction as a general principle, not the specific compartment, I taught to 2 apprentices in the years after the war, when I still took students. One was Otto Reinhold, though he learned it as an old journeyman, relearning his trade, not a boy. The other was a young man named Corliss." I looked up from my notebook. "Corliss, Voigt's shop manager." "The same young man." "Yes, though I did not know until you told me just now that he had gone to work for Emeric. I lost track of him after a disagreement, some years ago, over a piece of work I felt did not meet the standard I require. He wanted to move too quickly, cut corners a serious craftsman does not cut. I told him so, perhaps more harshly than I needed to. I have not seen him since, but he learned the double-back principle from me. In this room, at this desk, with these hands, before they began to shake." Wolfe sat with that for a long moment, eyes at half-mast, and I could see the shape of the thing assembling itself behind them, the way it does when a case starts to close ranks around a single name. "Mr. Kessler," he said finally, "does Mr. Corliss know the Meridian is the specific piece that contains something of wartime significance, or only that it contains a compartment?" I do not know what Emeric told him. Over the years, Emeric was not always as careful as I would have wished. He was a warmer man than I am, Mr. Wolfe. He liked being admired, liked telling a good story over a glass of brandy, and the Meridian was the best story either of us ever had to tell. I begged him, more than once, never to speak of it. I do not know that he always listened. "Archie," Wolfe said, "I believe we require a second conversation with Mr. Corliss, and I believe it should happen here rather than in his own shop, where he is comfortable. And I believe we should also learn, before that conversation, whatever can be learned about Otto Reinhold's final weeks, his mail, his visitors, whether he too received a gentleman in a Homburg asking after old-world craftsmanship. I spent the balance of the afternoon on the telephone and half the evening in Astoria, and by the time I got back to the brownstone, I had confirmation from Reinhold's landlady that yes, a tall, well-dressed man with a foreign way of talking had called on the old jeweler twice in his last 10 days alive, and that Reinhold had seemed, in her words, jumpy as a cat, after the second visit, keeping his door bolted even in daylight, which he'd never done before in 11 years as her tenant. Chapter 7. The Interrogation of Small Gears. Getting Corliss to the brownstone took a phone call. A lie about a consultation fee. Wolfe was prepared to pay for information about Voigt's business affairs, and Saul Panzer, sitting across the street in a parked Chevrolet, in case Corliss decided a consultation fee wasn't worth the trip after all. He came anyway, a little after 7, nervous in the way of a man who suspects the ground under him has gotten thinner since yesterday, but hasn't worked out exactly where the thin spots are. Wolfe didn't waste time. "Mr. Corliss, you studied under Anselm Kessler some years ago." Corliss's face did something complicated. Yes. Years back. I don't see what that has to do with Mr. Voigt. You learned from him the principle of the double case back. A second panel beneath the visible one, opened by pressure applied in sequence along the rim, invisible to anyone who does not already know it exists. The color went out of Corliss's face in a way that told me more than any answer could have. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," Wolfe said, without heat, "and the sooner you stop pretending otherwise, the sooner we may discuss the considerably more pressing question of who else you may have described that principle to, in the years since Mr. Kessler dismissed you as a student." Corliss's hands had found each other in his lap, twisting, and Loyal, who'd come to lie near the doorway when the shouting started, though nobody had shouted yet, lifted his head and watched him with the calm, unhurried attention he gives anybody whose voice has started to carry a tremor under the words. "I never told anyone the specific piece," Corliss said. "I swear it. Mr. Voigt knew because he'd worked the piece himself, but I never." He stopped. "Finish the sentence, Mr. Corliss." "There was a man," Corliss said, so quietly. I had to lean in to catch it. "Came around the shop. Oh, must be 2 months now. Said he was researching the history of the firm, wartime commissions, that sort of thing, for a book, wrote for some horological journal," he said, "though I never did see a copy of it. Asked a lot of questions that seemed harmless at the time. How pieces were cased, whether older craftsmen ever built in hidden features, that sort of thing. I didn't think anything of it. Talked shop, the way you do with a fellow who seems to know something about the trade himself. I never told him about the Meridian specifically. I don't even think I said Mr. Kessler's name outright, not that first visit, but I talked about the double-back principle in general terms, as an example of clever old-world craftsmanship, the kind you don't see young men bother learning anymore. I didn't know, Mr. Wolfe. I swear to you I didn't know it would matter." "You said not that first visit. There were others." Corliss's shoulders sagged, like a man who'd been holding a weight up so long he'd forgotten there was any other way to stand. 3 visits, maybe 4. Each time he seemed to know a little more than the last. And each time I told myself I hadn't given him anything he didn't already have. I told myself that right up until Mr. Voigt was found dead on that carpet, and then I couldn't tell myself anything at all. Description of this researcher: tall, well-spoken, English accent, or near enough, wore a hat indoors which I remember thinking was odd manners. I didn't need to write that one down, I already had it, word for word from 3 days earlier. "One further matter, Mr. Corliss," Wolfe said. "When precisely did your association with Mr. Kessler end, and on what terms? You called it a disagreement over quality of work. Was there more to it?" Corliss looked, for the first time since he'd sat down, genuinely miserable, rather than simply frightened. He caught me finishing a repair sloppy, cutting a corner on a client's piece, using a cheaper part than what was specified, hoping nobody would ever look close enough to know the difference. He knew the difference the moment he picked it up. Told me I'd never be worth the name I was trying to carry if I kept treating the work like that. He wasn't cruel about it, Mr. Wolfe, not exactly, but he was final. I never forgot it. I've thought about it near every day since, working for Mr. Voigt, wondering if the old man was right about me all along. There was something almost sympathetic in the way Wolfe regarded him then, though I doubt Corliss caught it. Guilt over a decade-old rebuke does not make a man a murderer, Mr. Corliss. Carelessness with a stranger's questions, however, may yet have made you an accessory to one. I suggest you consider that distinction carefully, and remain where Mr. Goodwin can find you. I saw Corliss out myself, and once he was down the stoop and headed toward the subway, jumpy as a man who expects to be followed and half hopes he will be. I gave Saul a nod from the window and went back to work on my own errand for the evening, which was Price Hartford. He was staying at a mid-priced hotel off Madison, respectable without being memorable, the kind of place a man picks when he wants a New York address, but doesn't want the doorman remembering his comings and goings too precisely. I spent 2 hours in a diner across the street with a cup of coffee. I let go cold twice, and around 10 he came out alone, no Homburg this time, dressed plainer than his daytime self, and walked 11 blocks to a public telephone box, rather than using the one in his own hotel lobby, which told me plenty about how much he trusted hotel switchboards to keep their mouths shut. I couldn't hear what he said. I could see his face through the glass though, lit up yellow by the booth's little bulb, and I've watched enough men make uncomfortable telephone calls to recognize one when it's happening in dumb show. He did more listening than talking, and whatever he was hearing, he didn't care for it. His free hand kept opening and closing at his side, and twice he looked back over his shoulder at the empty street behind him, the particular look of a man checking whether the person on the other end of the wire might somehow be closer than the wire allowed. He was in that booth the better part of 20 minutes. When he came out, he looked 10 years older than he had going in, and he took a cab back to the hotel instead of walking, which struck me as a man who no longer trusted the dark the way he had an hour before. I couldn't get a name off it, and I couldn't get a word of what was said, but I brought the shape of it home to Wolfe anyway, because sometimes the shape of a thing is worth as much as its contents. Somebody's leaning on him, I told Wolfe, and whatever they said, he didn't like hearing it. Then he is no longer merely useful to whoever hired him, Wolfe said. He has become, in their estimation, a liability requiring management. That is a valuable piece of knowledge, Archie, and I suspect Mr. Price Hartford knows it as well as we do. Chapter 8. The Decoy. It was Wolfe's idea to bait the trap with a lie, and it was a good enough lie that I spent most of an afternoon making it look true. We let it be known through Lon Cohen at the Gazette, who owed Wolfe a favor and collected one back in the form of a story he couldn't print for another week, that the Meridian had been recovered, quietly, by a private investigation, and was being held at the brownstone on West 35th Street, pending its authentication by an independent horologist before being returned to its rightful owner. It wasn't true. We didn't have the watch. What we had was Kessler's old steel pocket piece, wrapped in the same chamois cloth, sitting in the safe behind Wolfe's desk, and a great deal of confidence that whoever had killed twice for the real thing would rather take a third risk than let a fake mistake stand uncorrected in the newspapers. I spent the better part of that same afternoon making the story travel further than Lon's usual circle. A word dropped to a clerk at the Horological Society, who I happened to know was chatty. A call to a pawnbroker on 6th Avenue, who trafficked in gossip nearly as much as in watches, on the theory that a rumor moves faster through 3 loose mouths than through 1 careful one. The confidence turned out to be justified a little after midnight, when Fred Durkin, posted in the R-away with a clear line on the basement door, put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled the short note that means movement. I won't pretend the brownstone security is decorative. The man who came over the back wall got exactly as far as the garden before Apollo had him by the coat sleeve, and Mars had him by nothing at all, simply standing in front of him with 70 pounds of intention. And by the time I got the kitchen door open, Fritz was already there with the shotgun. He keeps by the pantry more for show than use, though the man on the ground didn't know that, and Caesar had planted himself squarely between the intruder and the house like a decision that had already been made. Minerva had taken up a position by the garden gate itself, watching the street beyond it, in case the man on the ground had brought company he hadn't yet used. It wasn't Price Hartford. It was a younger man, wiry, dressed for climbing rather than talking, and when I turned him over and got a good look at his face under the garden light, it wasn't a face I recognized at all, which told me something useful in itself. Price Hartford, whoever he really was, didn't do his own climbing. He's hired help, I told Wolfe 20 minutes later, once the police had come and gone with our uninvited guest, who'd said exactly nothing beyond his own name, which was almost certainly not his own name, which means our English collector's a step further back from the dirty work than I'd figured, and a step closer to being the one paying for it. Or, Wolfe said, he is not the principal at all, and merely another instrument, as Corliss was, unknowing. He drank the last of a beer that had gone flat an hour ago, and didn't seem to mind. "Archie, tomorrow I believe we should invite Mr. Price Hartford back to this office, and this time I do not intend to let him leave with his composure intact. And I believe further that it is time to learn precisely what Mr. Kessler and the late Mr. Voigt built that compartment to carry, in specific terms, rather than general ones. I have been patient with an old man's grief. I am no longer inclined to be patient with an old man's caution." Chapter 9. The Meridian's Confession. They came the next evening. All of them, Kessler, in the red chair by right of the client, Margit Halvorsen and Price Hartford, and Corliss arranged along the row of yellow chairs I'd set out, and Kramer standing by the bookcase with his hat still on, which is his way of pretending he isn't really staying. The dogs had settled into their evening positions around the room, Caesar by the door, Loyal at Archie's chair, Mars and Apollo flanking the window, Minerva by the hearth watching the whole gathering with the particular stillness she takes on when the household senses something is coming. Before Wolfe began, he asked Kessler one last question, quietly, almost gently, the kind of question he rarely bothers with when there's a room full of people waiting. "Mr. Kessler, are you prepared now to tell the room what you told Mr. Goodwin in confidence 3 days ago?" Kessler looked for a long moment at Margit Halvorsen, and something passed over his face that might have been an old man finally setting down a weight he'd carried further than his strength should have allowed. "Yes," he said, "I am." "I will not draw this out," Wolfe said, which from him is nearly a joke, and began. "In October of 1944, a Danish resistance network requiring a discreet means of moving a single sheet of coded intelligence out of occupied territory approached, through channels I never fully understood, and do not to this day, 2 young Swiss-trained watchmakers working in New York who had, some years earlier, done favors of a technical nature for men who did not explain themselves and did not need to. Mr. Kessler and Mr. Voigt were asked to build a vessel, something a courier could carry across borders and through searches without arousing suspicion, something that would pass as an ordinary object of value rather than a piece of tradecraft. They built the Meridian, a chronograph fine enough that any customs officer or suspicious soldier would assume its owner a wealthy man of leisure, rather than a schoolteacher carrying his country's secrets in his coat pocket. Margit Halvorsen's hands had gone very still in her lap. The document itself, once completed, never reached Kessler and Voigt directly. It was to be collected by the watch's intended courier. Once the piece reached him through an intermediary chain, neither watchmaker was permitted to know in full. What we do know is this: the courier assigned to carry the Meridian, and with it the notation it concealed, was a Danish schoolteacher named Rasmus Halvorsen, and that in October of 1944 he did not complete his assignment. He did not return home, and the watch, by a chain of custody that took Mr. Kessler 11 years and considerable personal anguish to reconstruct even partially, eventually made its way back into Emmerich Voigt's hands, not as a courier's tool any longer, but as a keepsake he kept, and in time wore, without, I believe, ever opening the second case back to learn what it still held. "He didn't know," Kessler said quietly, into the silence that followed. "I want that understood. Emmerich did not know the paper was still inside. We had built the compartment to be nearly impossible to find. He wore that watch for years believing it empty, believing whatever it once carried had long since been delivered or lost. I did not know either, until 3 nights ago, when a man I had never met came to my door and told me, with great confidence, exactly what he believed was still hidden inside a watch neither of us had seen since the war. That is how I learned it still existed at all, not through memory but through threat. Mr. Price Hartford is not a collector," Wolfe went on. "He is a broker, a man who locates objects of value to men who prefer not to be seen locating them themselves. He has spent a month circling Voigt's shop, because he was hired, by a party I will come to recover the Meridian, and, more specifically, what the Meridian's compartment was believed still to contain. Proof, in the form of a courier's coded notation, of exactly who in 1944 diverted a portion of a convoy's protection, for reasons that had nothing to do with the war effort and everything to do with private profit. Rasmus Halvorsen carried that notation out of Denmark. He never reached his contact. Somewhere in the confusion of October 1944, the watch reached Voigt's hands instead of its intended recipient, and there it sat, unopened, for over a decade, because Emmerich Voigt did not know what it contained, and was, I believe, afraid ever to find out. Voigt grew careless with age. Wolfe went on. He mentioned the piece's history, in general terms, to men who should never have heard it. Old colleagues from the trade, a young shop manager eager to be trusted with a good story. Word of an object worth $80,000 on the collector's market, with a secret besides, travels in circles, Mr. Price Hartford makes his living within. He was hired to find it. To find it, he needed to understand how it could be opened, which meant finding someone who knew the double-back principle, which led him, eventually, to Otto Reinhold, an old man easily frightened, and when frightening proved insufficient, easily killed. That's a hell of an accusation, Price Hartford said, but his English had thinned considerably since he'd sat down, and underneath it I caught something that hadn't been there before, something closer to Rotterdam than London. Reinhold told you what you needed, Wolfe said, or died before he could, and either way you turned next to the shop itself, and to Emmerich Voigt, who by then understood, perhaps for the first time in a decade, exactly what he had been sitting on, and refused to hand it over. He'd taken the watch to a strapmaker, 2 doors down that same week, which I believe was not vanity. I believe it was fear, and an attempt to keep the piece near him but not on his own body, where it made him a target every hour he wore it. "You've built a fine story, Mr. Wolfe," Price Hartford said. "You haven't a shred of proof I killed anyone." "I have this," Wolfe said, and nodded at me. I reached into the drawer and set the alligator strap on the desk, the one Del Vecchio had never handed back, the one Voigt had never returned for. "Mr. Del Vecchio," Wolfe said, "will testify that on the afternoon before his death, Mr. Voigt brought in the Meridian for a new strap and left without it. That watch, gentlemen, was not on Emmerich Voigt's body when he died, because he had deliberately parted with it the day before, hoping to buy himself time to decide what to do. Which means whoever killed him did not take the Meridian from a corpse. They tore his shop and his person apart looking for a watch that was never there. And when Sergeant Kramer's men finished searching a certain storage unit rented 3 weeks ago under the name Julian Hart, 4 blocks from Mr. Price Hartford's hotel, I believe they will find rather more than an empty velvet cushion." Kramer, who had clearly had that particular piece of legwork done sometime in the last 24 hours, without troubling to mention it beforehand, allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Price Hartford's composure finally gave out entirely, all at once, the way a watch spring lets go when it's been wound past its tolerance for too long. And what came out of him in the next 10 minutes about a man in Washington whose name he would give only under promise of leniency, about a convoy diverted in 1944 for reasons that had made somebody very rich and gotten a great many sailors killed for nothing, was enough to keep Kramer's stenographer working past midnight. Chapter 10. What the Old Man Kept. The Meridian itself turned up 3 days later, exactly where Voigt had left it. Del Vecchio had simply never opened the little drawer where he kept unclaimed pieces, having no reason to think a murdered man's watch was sitting 18 inches from where the police had searched twice. Kessler opened the second case back himself, in this office, with hands that shook the whole time, and steadied only once the panel lifted free. Inside was a single sheet of onionskin paper, folded so many times it had nearly worn through at the creases, covered in a hand, Margit Halvorsen, recognized before Wolfe had finished unfolding it. "That's my father's writing," she said, and didn't try to stop the tears, and nobody in the room thought less of her for it. Kessler reached over, slowly, and set one trembling hand over hers on the arm of the chair, and neither of them said anything further, which struck me as the more honest choice. What the paper actually said took the better part of a week to run down properly, and belongs, I think, to a different kind of story than this one. Men in Washington who would rather it stayed folded, a court-martial that happened 30 years too late to matter to the men. It should have mattered too, a quiet correction to a record that had been wrong since 90. Kramer got his collar for 2 murders and an attempted third. Halvorsen got, at last, the truth about her father's final assignment and the knowledge that he had completed it, even if the world took 11 years to notice. Corliss, for his part, was let go with a stern lecture from Kramer about the difference between innocent shop talk and negligence that gets men killed. A lecture I understand he took considerably more to heart than the one Kessler had given him years before about a badly finished repair. Kessler came by the brownstone one last time, a week after it was all settled, without the Meridian this time, that had gone, at his own insistence, to a museum, where he said it belonged, being a thing built for a purpose finer than sitting on anyone's wrist. "I did not think I would live to see it opened," he said, sitting in the red chair with his unsteady hands folded in his lap, though I noticed they trembled rather less than they had 3 weeks before. 41 years I carried the knowing of it, and Emeric carried it with me, and I think in the end it was the carrying that killed him, more than the men who did it with their hands. A secret is a mechanism too, Mr. Wolfe. Wound tight enough, for long enough, something in it eventually breaks. Wolfe, who had no comment to make on secrets or mechanisms that didn't somehow return to orchids, said only, "Mr. Kessler, your fee is settled. I trust you'll find some occupation for your remaining years that doesn't involve further burglary of my garden." Kessler managed something close to a laugh, the first I'd heard out of him, and left with considerably steadier steps than he'd arrived on 3 weeks before. At the door he paused, looked back once at Loyal, who'd come to see him out the way he does with visitors he's decided are worth the trouble, and said quietly, mostly to the dog, "A good watch and a good dog keep the same kind of time, I think. Faithfully, whether or not anyone is watching." Fritz had been working on a duck all afternoon. I caught the smell of it from the hall, orange and thyme, though it never once made it to a plate that evening, on account of Wolfe deciding at the last minute he wanted the shad roe instead, and Fritz being Fritz about accommodating him. Loyal came and put his chin on my knee sometime after 10, while I was finishing the last of the paperwork, and I sat there a while, just scratching his ears and thinking that Kessler had it about right. A secret's a mechanism. Wound tight enough, for long enough, something eventually breaks. Better, I figured, closing the notebook, that it broke in this office, where at least somebody was keeping proper time.